We'll see how it goes. We want to talk about peace this morning. 3 steps to peace. Peace is an interesting thing because almost everyone you talk to will say that they want peace. And have you ever talked to anybody who said, "No, I don't want peace, I want to fight. I want there to be strife and conflict and war all the time"? Not many people would just assert that that's what they want. However, the way people live their lives is far different from what they say. And a lot of people who say they want peace certainly don't live like they want peace. You see it all the time, that they are agitators, troublemakers, just people with a bad attitude looking for something to be upset at or someone to get upset with or to try to get someone upset at them. And we see that a lot in life. You've probably seen it. You see it at the grocery store or Walmart or wherever you go. You see it at restaurants. You see it all the time. You see it on the highways. People that are driving recklessly and endangering others because they don't really want peace. They may say they do, but they don't really want it. In Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 14, the writer of Hebrews tells us to follow peace with all men. Some translations even say pursue peace with all. Pursue that peace. Chase peace. Make it your goal and run after it. How well do we pursue peace? And most will say, well, I don't want any trouble, but boy, I tell you what, if they start some, I'm ready for them. Heard people say things like, well, Jesus said to turn the other cheek, but he didn't say what to do after that. But the Bible calls on us to pursue peace or follow peace with all men. He goes on to say, and holiness. So we need to pursue peace and we need to pursue holiness. Now, I'm not sure grammatically whether the phrase that follows just applies to the holiness or whether it applies to the peace and the holiness. But he goes on to conclude that verse by saying, without which no man shall see the Lord. Now, a lot of people say that only applies to the holiness, but I have a feeling that if we don't live at peace with others, and if we don't have peace within us, and certainly we know if we don't have peace with God, we won't get to see him. We won't get to experience a home with him for eternity. So we need to pursue that peace and view it as a very important, in fact, essential part of our Christian lives. And sometimes we don't think about it that way. We think, well, wouldn't it be nice if we had peace? This person and I are always fussing and fighting. Wouldn't it be nice if we could get along? Well, yes, it'd be nice, but also make the efforts that are necessary. Pursue peace. Now, we're also told to live at peace as much as lies within you, live at peace with all men. That verse does tell us that there is a limit. There are some people that you just can't have peace with. And when that's the case, you just have to get away from them because they won't let you be at peace. Galatians 5:22 through 25 tells us that the fruit of the Spirit is, and it's interesting, fruit is singular there. The fruit, not fruits. These aren't different fruits produced. This is the fruit that the Spirit produces in our lives. As Christians, we're to have the fruit of the Spirit growing in our lives. Love and joy and peace and long-suffering and gentleness, goodness and faith, meekness and temperance. He says, against such there is no law. But peace is one of those things that will be produced in our lives. That's part of the fruit that the Spirit will produce in our lives. He says, those that are Christ have crucified the flesh with the affections and lusts. He says, if we live in the Spirit, let us also walk in the Spirit. We're going to have these things in our lives. If we're missing any one of these things, of course, today's focus is peace because that's what we're talking about. But if we're missing any of these things that are described as being the fruit that the Spirit produces, we need to see why. We need to see, why am I missing that? If I'm a Christian, if the Spirit is living in me, then why is it not producing this fruit in my life? And it could be that I'm hindering God's work in my life. It could be that I'm keeping Him from turning me into what He wants to turn me into, which is an image of His Son. He wants me to be like Jesus. And He's actively trying to turn me into that as a Christian. He wants me to be that, and He's working to make me that. But sometimes I'm hindering Him. Sometimes I don't want to be that. I want what I want sometimes, and my own selfish will gets in the way of that. In Psalm 34 and verse 14, the psalmist says, turn away from evil and do good. Seek peace and pursue it. And this may very well be what the Hebrew writer had in mind. This is almost not quite a direct quote, but certainly alludes to this passage in Psalms where the psalmist says to do this. Seek peace. Sometimes peace is not just right there in the open. Sometimes you got to look for it. You got to seek it, kind of like hunting an Easter egg or something. It's hidden, and you got to find it sometimes. And sometimes if it takes work, we don't bother. If something's not just handed to us, we don't go to the trouble to seek it out. We don't go to the trouble to pursue it. We don't go to the trouble to put in the effort to make something happen if it doesn't just happen naturally. Unfortunately, because of the way that many human beings are, peace will not always come naturally. You've seen it. Maybe you've been a part of it, or at least you've been on the receiving end of people not being peaceful. But maybe you've been on the other end as well in your life. There are 3 steps we need to take. The first step is to get the poisonous habits and attitudes out of our life. When a basket is full of one thing, you can't very well put something else in, can you? Well, the story of the grandfather and the grandsons visiting the farm, and the grandfather says to the boy, go out and pick up all the sticks under the trees out there and fill this little basket up with the little wood chips and sticks and bring them in so we can have some kindling for the fire. So the grandchild goes out and does that and brings the basket back, and it's all full of the little wood chips and little sticks and things. And the grandfather says, okay, now go get all the chicken eggs and put them in the basket. And the grandchild says, well, I can't, Grandpa. The basket's full of the sticks. Oh, well, you're going to have to dump the sticks out first, and then there'll be room for the eggs. The same thing is true with our lives. There is only room for either a good attitude or a bad attitude. There's not room for both of them at the same time. There's not room for hatred and love for a person at the same time. We're either going to love them or we're going to hate them. You can't love and hate at the same time. There's not room for that. And so we need to watch out for these negative, poisonous attitudes that corrupt our minds and really will ruin our lives. And if you've known people who have these attitudes and these habits in their life, you know how miserable they are. I just list a few of them. This certainly isn't everything, but hatred, anger, grudges, and bitterness. You ever met somebody who held grudges and was bitter all the time? They weren't happy. They probably weren't healthy. They were miserable because they're always angry and holding grudges and bitter. I remember one man, one place that I preached. He hadn't been to church, but I heard he was in the hospital, so I went to visit him at the hospital. I'd never met him before in my life. He'd never met me. He didn't even know who I was from Adam. But when I walked in the hospital room and I went to see him because he was having ulcers and he was being treated for his ulcers. They had gotten so bad. So he was in the hospital with them. As I walked in, I introduced myself and said, I'm the preacher at such and such Church of Christ. And, I just thought I'd stop by and visit with you and everything. And he began to talk to me. And the first that he introduced, he said, yeah, that's me. I'm so and so. And then he said, you need to straighten him up down there at that church. What's wrong? He proceeded to tell me a story about how he had been mistreated by someone. I thought, well, we need to get this straightened out. And I said, well, what, did you try to take these steps? Did you go to your brother? Yeah. Did you get the church? Well, yeah, the church said, and then I said, well, when did this happen? He said, it was 50 years ago. 50 years ago. I wonder why he had ulcers. The first thing he told a person he met was about this horrible mistreatment that he had. And what it really boiled down to was his garden was next to a farmer's field, and they had the field crop dusted. And when they crop dusted it with the poison, it killed his garden 50 years ago. They didn't do it on purpose. The wind was probably blowing a little and blew some of it over there on his garden that was right next to their field. They didn't do it on purpose. But he was still holding a grudge 50 years later. You think he was a happy person? He was miserable. I'm quite sure he's not alive now, but at that time, some 30 years ago, he was a miserable individual who was suffering from ulcers, probably because he was worrying about things that happened 50 years earlier. Grudges and bitterness, anger and hatred, they will eat away at your soul, and they'll destroy your health too. Envy and jealousy, ooh, envy and jealousy, negative, poisonous things. Evil thoughts, divisive attitudes, mistrust and defensiveness. Always thinking somebody, they must be talking about me. What'd you say about me? What'd you mean by that? Sometimes we take things the wrong way when somebody didn't mean anything negative by it. And yet we get defensive and we think there's something negative. We need to be aware of that. And divisive attitudes, always trying to cause trouble and stir up division, mistrust. Those are things that are going to cause problems and going to destroy peace. We can't have peace with those things in our lives. Selfishness and greed. We can't have peace if we're selfish and greedy because we won't be able to compromise. We won't be able to share. And compromising and sharing are often parts of the peace process. We have to give up something. We have to sacrifice something. And somebody who's selfish and greedy will not sacrifice anything in order to have peace. Guilt, fear, paranoia, pride, conceit, and arrogance, deceit and doubt, impure motives. What can I get out of this? How can I do this for my advantage instead of thinking about what's best for everyone involved? Rebellion. Well, I'm just not going to cooperate. I don't want to cooperate. I don't want to get along. And there are other sins as well that could fit in this, but many of these are poisonous attitudes and poisonous habits that get formed that destroy any chance we have at having peace. And sometimes these things have built up between two people over a course of years. the mistrust, the selfishness, the pride, and they just neither one of them can say, "Look, I'm sorry. Can we start again? Can we try to work this out? Can we try to have peace again?" I've seen it with parents and children. I've seen it with siblings, seen it with other family members. I've seen it with neighbors. And it's just unbelievable how far it goes to the point that we can't have peace with someone sometimes. But we've got to start by getting these things out of our life. Now we can't control the other person. We can only control ourselves. But we get those things out of our lives, then the problem is, though, we can't just get them out and leave a vacuum. Nature hates a vacuum. So if we get those things out, the second step we have to take is we've got to fill our life with healthy habits and attitudes. We've got to replace those negative things with positive things. We need to replace them with truth, a sense of justice, and living justly, righteousness and obedience to God, purity, praise and encouragement. Look on the bright side. What do we look at when we see somebody else? Do we look at for a good in them, or are we looking for fault in them? So you'll find what you're looking for. It's true. Patience, kindness, gentleness, love, meekness, and hope. Those are the fruit of the spirit. You're not going to be able to develop one without the other many times. They go hand in hand. Hope, faith, trust, humility, and service. One of the best ways to stop being arrogant and thinking about yourself and being selfish is to serve somebody else. When you serve somebody else, you have to think about them. You have to think about what they want, what they need. Takes your mind off of you for a little while. Joy and pleasantness. There are so many good things, and we've all met a lot of different people in our lives. Which people do you like to be around? You like to be around the people that are like the first group that I described that has those attributes in their life? Or do you like to be around this group that has these attributes that we just mentioned in their lives? Which one? It's not a hard choice, is it? Most all of us, I like to be around this person because they're a positive person. They're a good influence or a good person. They're honest and hardworking, and they do, and I like that. The person's always, anytime I'm around them, I feel worse when I leave than I did before I got there. They bring me down. They talk about negative things all the time. They gossip. There's always something wrong. They find fault with everything. Yeah, who do you want to be around? Well, work to become the kind of person that you like to be around. When you see somebody doing what is right and good, and that makes them a better person, then strive to be like them. Follow their example. Step 3. Not only do we have to get the negative things out of our lives and put the positive things in our lives as far as our attitudes and things go, but we got to accept our responsibilities, obligations, and limitations in our relationships. Let's not forget that last word. Yeah, we're big sometimes about our responsibilities and obligations, but let's not forget about our limitations. We all have limitations in every relationship. We cannot make another person feel or think or act in a certain way. We don't have that power. So all we can control is all we can control. So first, we've got to think about our relationship with self. I don't think about this one sometimes. Chances are, though, if I can't get along with anybody around me, the problem is not everybody else. The problem is self. We've all met those people who couldn't get along with themselves. If they lived alone in a room, they'd argue with themselves about something. They can't get along with anybody else because they don't have peace in themselves. You've got to consider yourself and be honest about who you are. There may be some things about yourself that you don't like. Work on changing those, improving those. If you don't like it, it doesn't have to remain that way. If it's, I mean, there are some things we can't change, like our height or something, like that. Or, that we were born with a certain skin color or heritage or something like that. We can't change that. But our attitudes and our ways of behavior, we can change those things if we will, if we choose to. Think about self. And I know it seems odd to think about self, but if we cannot be at peace with ourselves, we will never be able to be at peace with anyone else. There's a book you might consider if you can find the time to read it. It's called Boundaries by Dr. Henry Cloud. And he talks a good deal about how important it is to be true to yourself and honest with yourself about who you are and what problems you cause in your relationships versus what problems really are coming from outside. And it can make a difference if we're honest with ourselves. It's easy to want to just blame that other person. But do we take responsibility for ourselves and our part in it? 1 Timothy chapter 4, verses 15 and 16. Paul says to Timothy, meditate upon these things. Give thyself wholly to them. Wholly to them. Give yourself to the Scriptures. Give yourself wholly to the things taught in the Scriptures, that your profiting may appear to all. Take heed to yourself and to the doctrine. Continue in them. For in doing this, you will save both yourself and those that hear you. And you might say, well, yeah, but Timothy was a preacher. So that's just it's for any of us. It's not just for the preacher, not just for Timothy. It's good advice for all of us. Take heed to yourself. Fix yourself first. Isn't that what Jesus said? Take the beam out of your own eye first before you try to take the speck out of your brother's eye. Fix yourself. And that's what Paul said. You take heed to yourself and to your doctrine. He says by doing this, you will save yourself and you'll save others, those that hear you, those that listen to you, if you'll do this. But you've got to take heed to yourself. You've got to practice what you preach. If you say other people shouldn't be a certain way, well, then you shouldn't be that way either. You got to live it out in your life. We've got to consider our relationships with our parents. Now, sometimes you say, well, my parents are dead and gone. Maybe so, but that doesn't mean they're not still influencing your life. Sometimes they're still a major player in how you behave and what you think and do and say. Probably any of us who have become parents have probably heard our parents come out when we say something to our children. That's the same thing my mom or dad used to say to me. We've all probably been there if we have children. But as children, we are to obey our parents in the Lord, for this is right. And that goes for young children, certainly, but even as adults. If our parents taught us things about how to be a Christian, we need to keep living that out in our adult lives as well. We need to consider that. Honor your father and mother, the first commandment with a promise. You go through the 10 commandments that Moses gave to the children of Israel. The first few, there's no promise. It's just do this or else. But then with the commandment to honor your father and mother that was given, there was a promise. Paul tells us that what that promise was. The promise was that it may be well with you and you may live long on the earth. You have a longer life if you listen to your parents and honor them. Sometimes that was quite literal because they'd kill you if you didn't. But sometimes it's because their wisdom would help you avoid things that would kill you. Of course, the original promise was also to the children of Israel that if they honored parenthood, if they honored their parents and that generation that came before them, the nation as a whole would continue to dwell in the land for a long period of time. One of the things that stopped happening, among other problems, was that they stopped honoring old age. They stopped honoring parents. They stopped listening to the generation that had gone before and they went their own way and followed after idolatry and all those things. So that's something we need to consider. For those that are married, there's a responsibility to the spouse, and there's a relationship with the spouse, and there are also limitations with the spouse. Ephesians 5:22 through 28 talks to husbands and wives about how they should treat each other. And it talks about how Christ loved the church and how Christ treated the church and how the church is to treat Christ. And it makes that comparison. And then, of course, we talked about your relationship to your parents. If you have children, there's a relationship to your children. Those are often strained. There's something about the different generations from us to our parents and from us to our children. It's weird how hard it is sometimes for those intergenerational relationships to work. It takes work. It's hard sometimes. But we need to work on that. Ephesians 6:4 warns fathers not to provoke their children to wrath, but to bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. And that nurture word is hard for fathers, especially. Fathers think the mother's supposed to do all the nurturing. But Paul says the fathers need to nurture too, not just admonish. Sometimes the wife does all the loving and the father does all the disciplining, and the children get a warped relationship with the parents because of that. Of course, there is the relationship we have as either an employer or an employee, or even if we're self-employed. We had those relationships in work of one kind or another. Ephesians 6:5 through 9 talks about how that relationship needs to be. You obey that master, that employer. The master, the employer, needs to be careful how they treat the employees because they have a master they're going to have to answer to. And one day, we will all give account for how we lived and interacted in that working relationship: servant, master, employee, employer, hired hand. Sometimes people are mistreated and not thought of very highly because of the work that they perform. They're looked down on. Had one of our cashiers at work yesterday called the manager, said, "I need you to come up here." One of the customers was cussing her out. She said, I need you to come up here. I'm not going to stand here and be treated this way." And it's amazing sometimes how you've seen it probably at a restaurant, how somebody treats a waiter or waitress like they're just the lowest level of life instead of treating them like another human being who's actually helping you get your food, which you need to live. How do we treat other people? How do we treat those that we employ? How would we treat and how do we treat those who employ us? As an employee, we give our best. As the employer, we protect and take care of the employees that we have and those that work for us. There's so much that goes into that, and that helps to make for peace. Some employers are spoken of badly because of the way they react. Some employees are spoken of badly because they won't work right. But if we're going to have peace in those relationships, we're going to have to do our part of it. We can't control the other person's side, except to say, if this employer is a bad one, I'm going to go work for somebody else. If this employee is a bad one, you're fired. I'm going to get somebody else. But we can have peace in that relationship if we are doing our part and if the other person does their part. Of course, we have a relationship with the government. That one's not very fun sometimes, and sometimes people don't like it. They don't like the relationship they have with the government. They want it to be different. Well, of course, in our country, we can vote for different leaders that will then help make the government different in some way. But we are to, Romans 13, 1 through 6 tells us, be subject to the higher powers, the governing authorities, the rulers. We need to be subject to that. And we need to not just think, well, I don't like it, so I'm not going to obey it. It doesn't work that way. And of course, we have relationships with our neighbors. Are you a good neighbor? They say good fences make good neighbors. Sometimes I guess that may be true, but a lot of times fences just separate people from being good neighbors. Just depends. But are you at peace with your neighbors? And then you might say, well, yeah, the person that lives next door to me, we get along famously. But Jesus was asked the question, who is my neighbor? And do you remember the parable that he told? He told the parable of the man who was going down the road and got mugged and robbed and beaten up and left for dead. And the Samaritan, remember that good Samaritan that we talk about? The Samaritan stopped and helped him when other people wouldn't. Jesus said, that's your neighbor. Your neighbor's the one that needs help. And if you can offer that help and if you can give that help, then you help them. Sometimes there's not much you can do. Sometimes maybe somebody's broke down on the side of the road with their car, and you can stop and check on them, and they say, "Well, I've already called the tow truck or whatever, or I've already called, my brother, my father, or my husband, or whatever. I've called my wife to come in, whatever. I called somebody to come get them, and then they're gonna have the car towed to the shop, and that's all you can do. If you don't know how to fix the car, which they've gotten to the point now where most of us don't anymore. Some of those new ones, you can't even check the oil in them. It's gotten crazy with that. But that's the thing. If we can help, do we help? Now, maybe we could still do some things, but there are some things we can't. Galatians 5:13 through 14 tells us that we've been called to liberty, but we should not use our liberty as an occasion for the flesh, but by love serve one another. We need to serve each other. The law is fulfilled in this one word, he says. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love your neighbor as yourself. We need to do that. Of course, we have a relationship with other Christians. Think more highly of others than of yourself. 1 Thessalonians 5:13 through 15 tells us to esteem them very highly in love for their work's sake and be at peace among yourselves. If there's one place where we ought to have peace in our relationships, it's in the church where everyone is supposed to be trying to follow Christ. It ought to be the most peaceful of places. Unfortunately, sometimes it's not. Maybe because someone isn't trying to follow Christ and they're after their own selfish ambition, and that can cause problems. But we should have peace in the church. And again, as much as lies within us, we should be peaceful. He tells us, don't render evil for evil to anyone, but follow that which is good. And then we also finally, I say finally, but really in some ways it's most important. And yet, while it's most important, it also is dependent upon some of these others. John tells us that we cannot love God whom we have not seen and hate our brother whom we have seen. The final relationship is that relationship with God. Our relationship with God, however, is dependent upon whether we have a good relationship with our fellow man. In fact, so much so that Jesus said, if you're at the altar to offer your offering and you realize that your brother has something against you, you go get it straightened out and then come back and give your offering. He basically says, your offering to God and trying to have a right relationship with God while you don't have a right relationship with your brother isn't going to work. That offering is vain and meaningless in that setting. What about you? What about me? Are we following peace? Have we put all of the negative things out of our lives and put the positive things into our lives? Have we accepted our responsibilities in our relationships with others? Have we accepted our obligations and are we fulfilling our obligations in our relationship to others that we've mentioned here? And do we recognize our limitations in our relationships? Are we trying to do too much in our relationships with others? Are we trying to make them into something? Or are we simply working on ourselves to become what God wants us to become? If you're here and you have a need to come to Christ, outside of Christ, there is no peace. No peace with God. No true peace with self. No peace with fellow man. But through Christ, we can have peace with ourselves. We can have peace with our fellow man. And we can be reconciled to God and have peace with Him. If you're not a Christian, become one today. If you are a child of God, but perhaps you struggle in some of your relationships, and you don't have peace in some of them, maybe you need prayers to take the step necessary to correct those relationships as much as lies within you. If you're here and you have a need to respond to God's invitation for any reason, please do so as we stand and sing.